In the dense forests of upstate New York, beneath the floorboards of an abandoned church, 143 unmarked graves were discovered in 1862. Local authorities documented that each skeleton showed signs of systematic torture, with fractured limbs that had healed before death, evidence of repeated near drowning, and strange markings carved into their bones. For over 160 years, federal records concerning the Church of the Pure Spirit remain sealed, accessible only to those with special clearance. I have obtained documents, never before revealed to the public, that detail how three brothers, known as Elder Ezra, Deacon Silas, and Prophet Caleb Ravencroft, convinced hundreds of devoted followers that suffering was the only path to salvation. These papers reveal how their dark rituals of purification led to what may be the most disturbing religious cult in American history. The small settlement of Ravenwood in upstate New York was, in most ways, unremarkable during the early 19th century. Nestled between rolling hills and dense forests approximately 40 miles north of Albany, it consisted of perhaps 300 souls who made their living through farming, timber, and trade with neighboring communities. The town had been founded in 1803 by settlers moving north from the Hudson Valley, seeking fertile land and new opportunities. Like much of upstate New York during this period, Ravenwood found itself at the epicenter of what historians would later call the Second Great Awakening. This was a period of intense religious revival that swept across America in the early 1800s. The region became known as the Burned-Over District because the fervor of religious movements seemed to ignite and spread like wildfire across its communities. It was a time when new denominations were born, old faiths were questioned, and charismatic preachers could draw crowds numbering in the thousands to outdoor revival meetings. Into this spiritual tumult arrived the Ravencroft brothers in the summer of 1825. Elder Ezra, the eldest at 42, had the commanding presence of a man accustomed to being obeyed. His deep-set eyes, nearly black in certain light, seemed to peer into one's very soul when he spoke of divine matters. Deacon Silas, 39, was more scholarly in appearance, with wire-rimmed spectacles and slender fingers perpetually stained with ink from his continuous writing of religious texts. Prophet Caleb, the youngest at 35, possessed an unsettling quality that many found both attractive and disturbing. He spoke in whispers that somehow carried across crowded rooms, and his pale blue eyes would often roll back during what he claimed were divine visions. The brothers arrived with substantial means, purchasing a large tract of land on the outskirts of town where they immediately began construction of what they called the Church of the Pure Spirit. Unlike the simple white-clapboard meeting houses common throughout New England and New York, their church was built of dark stone quarried from the nearby hills. Its architecture was unusual, a central octagonal sanctuary surrounded by 8 smaller chambers, with a steeple rising to a height that seemed excessive for such a remote location. Most striking was the absence of windows in the main sanctuary, with light provided only by carefully positioned lanterns during services. "We have been called by the Spirit to this place," Elder Ezra announced at their first gathering, which curiosity had made well attended despite initial skepticism from locals. "In an age of false prophets and lukewarm faith, we bring the true message of purification through tribulation. The Spirit has revealed to us that this community shall be the cradle of a new understanding." The brothers had timed their arrival perfectly. The religious landscape of 1825 America was fractured and uncertain. Traditional denominations like the Episcopalians and Presbyterians were losing ground to more emotional and demonstrative faiths. Methodists were gaining converts through circuit riders who brought fiery sermons to the frontier. Baptists were expanding rapidly with their emphasis on individual conversion experiences, and new American-born faiths were emerging. The Mormons would begin their journey just 1 year later and less than 100 miles away when Joseph Smith published the Book of Mormon in 1830. In this environment of spiritual searching, the Ravencrofts' message found fertile ground. Their doctrine was deceptively simple at first. True salvation could only be achieved through suffering that burned away sin and impurity. They cited biblical passages about refinement through fire and Christ's suffering on the cross. But what distinguished their teaching was the literal interpretation. Physical suffering was not just metaphorical but necessary for spiritual cleansing. The flesh is the vessel of sin, Deacon Silas would explain during early sermons, his voice measured and reasonable. Therefore, the flesh must be tested, tried, and purified through tribulation. Only when the body has been broken can the spirit truly soar. Their congregation grew steadily through that first year. The brothers were selective about who could join, requiring potential members to undergo a discernment interview with Prophet Caleb, who would determine if they were worthy vessels for purification. Those accepted were predominantly from three groups: the desperately poor, seeking community and purpose; the deeply troubled, seeking redemption from past sins; and the wealthy, seeking spiritual experiences beyond what traditional churches offered. Margaret Wilkins was among the first converts, a widow who had lost her husband and 2 children to scarlet fever the previous winter. She had been contemplating ending her life when she encountered Elder Ezra in town. "He looked at me as though he could see my thoughts," she wrote in a journal later discovered by federal investigators. "He told me my suffering had meaning, that it was preparing me for a greater purpose. For the first time since burying my family, I felt something other than despair." By 1827, the Church of the Pure Spirit had grown to nearly 100 members. Some lived in simple dwellings constructed around the church, while others maintained homes in Ravenwood but spent most of their time at the church compound. The Ravencrofts encouraged members to donate their property and savings to the church, explaining that worldly attachments prevent spiritual elevation. The most devoted followers were invited to become vessels of the Spirit, a special status that required them to undergo more intensive purification rituals. These early ceremonies were relatively mild compared to what would come later: extended fasting, night-long prayer vigils, and rituals involving ice-cold water that symbolized the drowning of the sinful self. What few outsiders realized was how methodically the Ravencrofts were escalating the intensity of these practices. Like the proverbial frog in slowly heating water, their followers were being conditioned to accept increasingly extreme forms of purification without recognizing the dangerous path they were traveling. By 1829, when construction began on an extensive network of chambers beneath the church, the Ravencrofts had established complete control over their followers' lives, thoughts, and bodies. The stage was set for darkness to descend upon the Church of the Pure Spirit. As Prophet Caleb reportedly told his brothers in a private meeting documented years later, "The sheep have been gathered. Now begins the true work of the shepherd." The people of Ravenwood would soon discover that the Ravencroft brothers' definition of shepherd had little to do with protection and everything to do with sacrifice. The transformation of the Church of the Pure Spirit from an unusual but seemingly benign religious community to something far more sinister can be traced to a specific date: December 21, 1829, the winter solstice, the longest night of the year. What occurred that night would later be referred to in secret church documents as the First Ascension and would establish the pattern for the horrors that followed. The day began with an announcement from Elder Ezra that Prophet Caleb had received a profound vision during the night. The entire congregation was summoned to the church for what was described as a revelation of the next level of purification. As darkness fell and the temperature dropped below freezing, nearly 150 followers filled the windowless sanctuary, which was illuminated only by 12 large candles positioned at the points of an enormous pattern carved into the wooden floor, a spiral that wound inward toward a central platform. Thomas Hartford, a blacksmith who had joined the church 6 months earlier following the death of his wife, later escaped and provided testimony about what happened next. According to Hartford, Elder Ezra addressed the congregation with unusual intensity, his voice rising to a fever pitch as he described how their previous purification rituals had been merely preparation for the true cleansing. "Brothers and sisters," Elder Ezra proclaimed, "we have been patient shepherds, guiding you gently toward understanding, but the Spirit grows impatient with our progress. Tonight, Prophet Caleb has been shown the true path to salvation, and it requires greater courage than we have yet demanded." At this point, Prophet Caleb emerged from one of the side chambers. Witnesses described him as appearing transformed, his skin unnaturally pale, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, his eyes rolled back to show only whites. He began to speak in what he claimed was the tongue of angels, a series of guttural sounds and high-pitched wails that echoed through the sanctuary. After several minutes of this disturbing display, Prophet Caleb collapsed to the floor. When he rose again, he spoke in his normal voice, but with a cadence and authority that many found mesmerizing. He announced that the Spirit had selected 3 members of the congregation for the honor of first ascension. Sarah Pembroke, Michael Collins, and Rebecca Winters, he called out. The Spirit has found you worthy of elevation. The 3 individuals, all relatively recent converts to the church, were led to the central platform by Deacon Silas. What followed was described by Hartford as a ceremony unlike anything I believed possible among civilized people. Each of the 3 was stripped to their undergarments despite the winter cold. They were then bound to wooden frames that had been constructed in the shape of inverted crosses. Elder Ezra explained to the congregation that inverting the sacred symbol was not blasphemy but rather represented the necessary reversal of fortune, from pride to humility, from comfort to suffering, from life to death to rebirth. For the next several hours, the Ravencroft brothers subjected the 3 chosen ones to a series of torments they called the 7 trials of purification. First came the trial of air, in which wet cloths were placed over their faces while water was slowly poured over them, creating the sensation of drowning. Then came the trial of earth, where soil from the church grounds was packed around their bodies up to their necks, effectively burying them alive for short periods. The trial of fire involved heated metal implements pressed briefly against their skin, leaving burn marks in specific patterns. The trial of water saw them repeatedly submerged in ice-cold water until they lost consciousness, then revived. Hartford's testimony becomes fragmented when describing the final 3 trials, as he admitted to having vomited and nearly fainted during the proceedings. What is clear from multiple accounts is that throughout these tortures, the 3 victims were encouraged to embrace their suffering as divine blessing. Whenever they screamed in pain, the congregation was instructed to chant, "Through suffering comes purity. Through purity comes elevation." Most disturbing was the congregation's response. Hartford reported that while some members wept quietly or looked away, many appeared entranced, watching with expressions of reverence or ecstasy. The Ravencrofts had spent years conditioning their followers to associate pain with spiritual advancement. And now that conditioning bore its terrible fruit. Near dawn, when the 7 trials were complete, the 3 victims hung limp on their frames, barely conscious but still alive. Elder Ezra announced that they had been emptied of sin and were now ready to be filled with the pure Spirit. What happened next would haunt those who witnessed it for the remainder of their lives. Prophet Caleb approached each victim and placed his hands on their heads, whispering into their ears. According to Hartford and one other witness who later spoke to authorities, the 3 victims suddenly convulsed violently, their bodies arching against their restraints with such force that bones could be heard breaking. Their eyes flew open, bulging and bloodshot, and they began speaking in the same strange language Prophet Caleb had demonstrated earlier. By sunrise, all 3 had died. Elder Ezra proclaimed them successfully ascended and declared that their souls had been so thoroughly purified that they had been accepted directly into heaven, bypassing judgment. Their bodies, he explained, were merely empty vessels now to be revered as holy relics. The 3 corpses were not buried immediately. Instead, they were placed in one of the newly constructed chambers beneath the church, laid out on stone slabs where congregation members could view them and pray for similar elevation. According to church records later seized by authorities, these were the first of what would eventually become hundreds of bodies stored in the catacombs beneath the Church of the Pure Spirit. The morning after the first ascension, several congregation members quietly packed their belongings and fled Ravenwood. Thomas Hartford was among them, though he would not speak of what he had witnessed for many years, believing no one would believe such horrors possible in Christian America. Those who remained became even more devoted to the Ravencrofts and their twisted doctrine. The brothers had crossed a threshold into murder disguised as religious ceremony and found that their control over their followers was not diminished but strengthened. Within the Church of the Pure Spirit, death had become sacrament. As Prophet Caleb reportedly told his brothers after the ceremony in a conversation later recounted by a church elder who eventually turned state's evidence, "Now we have shown them the true face of God, and they did not turn away." There is nothing they will not accept from us now. He was right. The first ascension marked only the beginning of the atrocities at the Church of the Pure Spirit. What followed would be 3 decades of escalating horror hidden behind the respectable facade of religious devotion.